Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Yuritza Escalante. I am a third-year psychology major at the University of California, Riverside. I worked on this project alongside graduate student researcher Eleanor Collier and faculty member Dr. Brant Hughes. And today I will be presenting on the topic identifying at-risk groups for decreases in social connection caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. It wasn't going forward. Okay, so social connection plays a dominant role in determining an individual's sense of well-being. And as we have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, this social environment has shifted dramatically with the restrictions being put in place with social distancing and having to quarantine at home. We no longer have as easily access to be able to form those social connections with others as we did before. And along with these restrictions, COVID-19 has also brought about increased feelings of loneliness, depression, anxiety, and overall stress. And although there are these great shifts in social environment and emotions that people are feeling, so far research does not show that there's been an average decline in social connection during the pandemic. So this led us to wonder, and this has been seen in just the overall general population. So this led us to wonder whether there may be particular groups nested within the general population that are particularly at risk of experiencing this decrease in social connection. Previous research also shows that high anxiety and high depression are correlated with lower rates of social connectedness. And this is simply in normal conditions. And additionally, low extroversion has been correlated with having difficulty adapting to social changes. So because of this previous research and for these reasons, we chose to examine this inspired the groups that we will be examining in today. So we will be looking into the groups of individuals lower scoring on extroversion, higher scoring on anxiety, social anxiety, and depression. So in the study itself, we recruited 90 participants before the pandemic and 120 during the pandemic. These were all students from the University of California, Riverside, and these participants were recruited through the SONA research participation system. They completed this study for a course credit and a chance at winning an Amazon gift card. The median age of our participants is around 19 years old, and the majority of our participants came from an ethnic background of either Asian or Hispanic, with 43% being Asian and about 30% being Hispanic. So once signed up for this, study, participants first met with a research assistant either in the lab if this was before the pandemic or through a Zoom call during the pandemic. And they were first told to complete an initial set of questionnaires in which they were measured on their overall well-being and just traits about themselves. So this is where we found a lot of the measurements that we will be looking into today, which are extroversion, anxiety, social anxiety, and depression. And these traits were measured in accordance to their appropriate scale, which is listed here. And after completing this initial set of questionnaires, participants were then told that they were going to be completing daily diary surveys. So what this is essentially a place for participants to go and report about meaningful interactions that they experienced throughout their day, otherwise known as disclosures, along with additional details about their day and how these disclosures make them felt. An item that was included in this survey asked, how connected did you feel with your conversation partner? And this was asked on a scale of 0 to 100. And this item is how we measured for social connectedness, which is what we're looking into today. The participants were told that they were going to be filling out these daily diary surveys every day for across the course of 10 days, and they would complete them through an app. So after completing this study and accumulating all of the data, we first looked into whether there is a trend in social connection from before the pandemic to during the pandemic, and to see whether this lined up with the literature. And we found that there was no significant average decline in social connection. So this completely lines up with what we had read into before. The way that we looked into this is by using a multi-level regression model. This allowed us to look into when the participant completed the study and the amount of social connection that they had reported. And along with this, we included random intercepts for days nested within participants to control for the data's multi-level structure. So what this means is that since each participant essentially filled out 10 of the surveys, this was a way for us to keep the data organized, and that those 10 submissions did stay accounted to with that one participant, that it stayed, all of them stayed organized within that one participant. And so this is how we found our results on the overall social connection. And since we did not find that overall average decline, we found that when beginning to examine particular groups within the data, we began to find marginal differences. And so in order to look into the particular groups, we examined the interaction between cohort and potential at-risk group on social connection. Cohort refers to when the participant participated in the study, so either before the pandemic or during the pandemic, and the potential at-risk group refers to the measurement that we will be looking into. So before going into all of these charts, I first want to explain kind of what it's talking about. First, this talks about the trait that we're particularly looking into and the amount of social connection that that participant reported feeling during that time that they participated. And we also see two lines. The red line shows their report during the pandemic, and the blue line shows before the pandemic. So when looking into our extroverted group, we find that participants scoring lower on extroversion did see that decrease in social connection during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. We see that a marginal, this is a weak effect. It wasn't significant, or it wasn't very strong. Next, when going into our anxiety group, we also saw that a weak effect also appeared here. The high anxiety participants did report having a decrease in social connection before the pandemic compared to during the pandemic. And also in social anxiety, we found a marginal effect as well, in which participants scoring high on social anxiety experienced a decrease in social connection during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. And interesting enough, in the depression group, we found that there was no significant difference between the groups in their reported social connection during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. We could see right here that high scoring participants that scored high on depression, there's a lot of overlap in their in what they had reported before the pandemic and during. So because of that, there was no significant difference on their social connectedness. So although we only found marginal effects in these groups, there were certain groups that showed stronger effects than others. The strongest effect was seen in the social anxiety group, followed by the anxiety group, and then the extroversion group, and lastly the extroversion group, and then the depression group, the effect was not seen there. So the reason why these results are interesting is because past research had shown that higher rates of anxiety and depression are correlated with lower rates of social connectedness. And again, this is just under regular conditions. So this led us to wonder whether related groups, whether there would be an impact of the pandemic on similar groups. And also how low extroverted individuals experienced more difficulty adjusting to social changes. This was seen in a study that examined extroversion in individuals in context of the pandemic as well. So that's why we found that group, in addition to interesting to look into as well. And although our results do show weak effects, these were for the directions that we had predicted in this study, which the direction that we had predicted was that these groups would be experiencing a decrease in social connection during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. And no effect was found in the depression group, which that one was surprising because the literature had looked into the depression group in terms of social connectedness. But however, a limitation to our study is that different individuals were tested before the pandemic compared to during the pandemic. So this may be a reason to why we found these results, in contrast to the same individuals being tested across time. And then another was that data for this study was collected during the beginning of the pandemic for the during the pandemic group. And this may had this may have had an effect on the strength of the social connection, or on the strength of the negative effects seen, just because there may have not been enough time set in which these negative social effects could have gotten stronger. Maybe they weren't as strong in the beginning of the pandemic, but then built up over time, more compared to a group that maybe was had been in the pandemic for a longer amount of time and had experienced these negative social consequences more strongly. So that's something that future research can look into, whether there's a difference in which the strength of these negative social effects is affected by time, and which part of the pandemic, especially like now, we've been in this pandemic for about a year, so it's significantly different, the experience now compared to how it was in the beginning. But nevertheless, the results indicate that high anxiety, high social anxiety, and low extroversion could potentially could worsen the negative effect of the pandemic on people's social connection. And this indicates that we may need to focus on intervening to improve social connection for these at-risk groups during long periods of social isolation, and even during normal times in which these groups may be subjected to this isolation in their circumstance. So that is my presentation. I would like to thank my the graduate student researcher, Eleanor Clear, and faculty, Dr. Brent Hughes, for working with me through this project and guiding me. And also I'd like to thank everyone for being here and listening to my presentation. I am now open to taking any questions that anyone may have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating.